Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kate Kuzminski, Director of the Military Veterans and Society Program at the Center for New American Security. CNAS is committed to bold, innovative, bipartisan research that drives national security policy forward. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us today for our virtual roundtable, the fourth in our planned multi-part series on race in the military. This event will focus on conceptions of citizenship and the military. Previous discussion sessions focused on the lived experiences of people of color in the United States military, effective leadership in an increasingly diverse force, and diversity and inclusion efforts in the US Air Force. In previous sessions, we've discussed ways in which the belief that racism is no longer an issue in the US military obscures some very real challenges facing each of the services. The data today is quite clear. While the US military is broadly representative of racial and ethnic makeup of the country, it continues to lack diversity in the most senior ranks, in elite career fields such as Special Forces and the Navy SEALs, and in documented racial disparities in disciplinary actions. As my predecessor, Kayla Williams, acknowledged at the beginning of this series, why is the National Security Think Tank addressing issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion? Beyond the personal and moral toll of racism within the military, a failure to adequately address diversity, equity, and inclusion challenges and opportunities significantly impacts the service's ability to recruit and retain competitive talent. In order for the United States to remain competitive, the services must be able to take advantage of the nation's talent pool and foster cultures in which top performers choose to remain in military service. We're proud to partner with our Adjunct Senior Fellow, Jason Dempsey, alongside Anthony Robinson of the National Democratic Training Committee, in hosting a series of semi-monthly discussions on how to make military leadership more inclusive and diverse. We're also grateful for the support provided by the nonprofit Millions of Conversations, a media-driven campaign designed to change existing narratives that marginalize and politicize conceptions of the other. Once again, I'm very pleased that CNAS is able to host today's discussion on these vital issues. Now I'll turn it over to our moderators, Anthony and Jason.
Thank you, Kate. I'm really glad to be here. I'm very excited to be joining CNAS for this discussion that I think is very timely and may not be able to tackle all the issues, but starting the conversation is a very critical piece. And so I'm looking forward to a great panel today, and we are joined with two people that I consider great and esteemed colleagues. And I'll introduce our first panelist, which is Meg Gulliford, who is a Penn Provost postdoctoral fellow in residence at Perry Worldhouse. She's a writer and a Presidential Management Fellow alumna. Her writing and analysis has appeared in the Washington Post and Task and Purpose. We are also joined by Dr. Ted Johnson, who is a senior fellow and director of the Fellows Program at the Brennan Center for Justice at the NYU School of Law. He's an author and a Navy veteran. His upcoming book, which we're excited about, When the Stars Begin to Fall, Overcoming Racism and Renewing the Promise of America, will be available on June the 8th. His writing and analysis has been published in the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and the National Review. We will start with a 35 or 45 minutes of moderated questions and then open it up to the audience for questions. If you have questions for our panelists, please be sure to enter them in the chat box at any time.
Thanks, Anthony. It's a pleasure to be here today with both Meg and Ted. And as Kate mentioned, right, the conversations thus far have largely been about achieving equality of opportunity within the military. But we're excited today to engage the two of you on the question of what role do these internal military struggles and the symbolism of military service itself kind of play in the broader societal struggle for equality. This is something you've both either directly experienced or addressed in your writing and scholarly work. So before we get to specific questions, Anthony gave a very quick summary of your resumes, but for the context of this discussion, could each of you discuss what we might have missed or what's particularly relevant from your work or personal experience that has brought you to the forefront of this particular conversation on race in the military? I'd love to start, Meg, if you'd like to kick us off. Meg, mute.
I'm unmuting myself. I apologize. Why I muted myself in the first place, I don't understand. However, like Anthony said, my name is Meg Gulliford, and while I am currently in academia, I started my career as a presidential management fellow working for the Marine Corps. I came to Headquarters Marine Corps as a pure civilian. I had no background in military service. No one in my immediate family was in the military. And so when I arrived, I knew nothing. So I had no service allegiance or anything like that. So over time, I moved from working for the Marine Corps to working for OSD staff. And there you could see the differences. As a woman of color moving from one staff to the other, the most diverse staff I ever worked on was actually the first office I worked at within Headquarters Marine Corps. And it's over time, the higher I got, the less diversity I saw with respect to both gender and race and ethnicity overall.
And Ted, over to you for opening comments.
Yeah, so again, thanks for having me here, and really looking forward to the conversation. I think where I will start is kind of a reflection that I used in a National Review piece from last year following George Floyd's killing, and now we can call it a murder because of the outcome of the Chauvin trial. And in this piece, I open up with a conversation I was having just before I retired from the Navy in 2016. And just as Colin Kaepernick was beginning to kneel during the national anthem in a racial justice protest, and I was asked by one of my colleagues in the Pentagon what I thought about Kaepernick kneeling. And I sort of bookend this article talking about the night, or actually a few nights before I left for officer candidate school, and how I was stopped by the police. I had been out smoking cigars with friends, and the police thought my cigar butt was a blunt, and pulled me over, and I ended up in jail because my license had expired, and an absent college-minded kid, I didn't remember to renew it. And instead of releasing to my parents or friends or something, I spent several hours in jail. And I thought a lot about the many times that I've been pulled over and how I sought refuge in my service by presenting my military ID card along with my license and registration. And I think what this sort of shows is that it's an experience that is best encapsulated by the recent headlines about Lieutenant Nazario in Virginia, Army second lieutenant who was stopped by the police and pepper sprayed while in uniform because the police didn't notice that his temporary tag was in his window and not on the plate holder. So this is sort of a long lead in, and by way of story, to say that there is a particular existence that I've had as a Black man in America, and another existence that I've had as a military officer in America. And oftentimes, as a Black man in uniform, you are pulling on the nation's history in multiple ways. And for much of the nation's history, my skin color, my race, made me the antithesis of what it meant to be American. And yet the uniform that I wore made me an exemplary of what it means to be an American. And when these two things are held together, a Black man in uniform, a Black person in uniform, it challenges what we think about ourselves, the narrative, the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. It challenges what we think about different people based on their race and ethnic groups, and how service does or does not protect folks from those perceptions and stereotypes that we have of different racial groups. So the question of citizenship in the United States, I think, is thrust together in particular ways when you have those who have been historically at the lower end of the social strata suddenly ascend to the higher end by virtue of their military service, and yet all of the rights and privileges that attend citizenship and that attend service in uniform don't always follow the folks that sort of straddle these two existences, these two identities.
It's a fascinating conversation, and I think you're highlighting that point, especially poignant for those of us who've had the privilege of not thinking a lot about these issues. For your average white officer or your white member of the military, right? When you get pulled over from police, having your military ID card isn't just a way of getting fairly treated. It's almost a get out of jail free card, right? We're not even going to bother you. Hey, thanks. We'll have a quick chat about what units you're in, and send you on your way. So it's interesting how these are ranked and stacked, and what role does this really play? So to build on your writing, Ted, in a recent article, you included this great quote from Frederick Douglass, where way back in 1865, he accused the United States of considering Black people to be Americans only when their bodies and braveries were needed for war, not when the nation betrayed their loyalty by allowing their oppression. He asked, shall we be citizens in war and aliens in peace? Would that be just? And this quote highlights a lot of what you've talked about in terms of the intersection and symbolism of military service in establishing equality and full citizenship. Can you help maybe and dive a little deeper for the audience here and help us understand how this is played out in the United States across time?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start at the beginning. In 1776, when our nation declared its independence, we had Black Americans, whether they were called Americans or not is a different question, but they were Black Americans fighting in Washington's army for the nation's independence. And many of them, one of the people I write about in my book is this guy, Jehu Grant from Rhode Island, escaped slavery and made his way to Connecticut in order to enlist in the Continental Army and fight for the nation's independence, also as a means of fighting for his own independence. And he served in the military for about 10 months or so. And then the man that owned him tracked him down and told the army, you are holding my property. And the army turned Jehu back over to his owner, who then took him back to Rhode Island, and he served and was returned to slavery. He ended up dying blind and penniless, even after the United States decades later determined that if you had served in the Revolutionary War, that you were due a pension from the United States. And what the United States government said was that your services rendered while a fugitive from slavery are not recognized by the government. And so he was denied the very benefits that he fought for, never mind the independence that he fought for. The War of 1812, Black folks, again, escaped slavery to fight for the United States, and others were bribed by the British to go fight for the British with the promise of freedom after the war was over. Those who fought for the United States, like those, again, in a Rhode Island regiment, only 10% of them were ever granted manumission, and the rest were returned to slavery, whereas those who fought for the Brits were given land and their freedom in Trinidad. And in fact, there are places in Trinidad where the descendants of these folks, Black folks who fought in the War of 1812, still reside. And I could talk to you about the Civil War. I could talk to you about the denial of GI benefits to World War I and II veterans. And so the point here is that for as long as there has been a United States of America, Black people have fought, and not just Black people, but people of color have fought for inclusion and for the nation. And those two things tied to one another. The thinking being that how can a nation founded on the principle of equality and liberty deny me equality and liberty if I'm willing to risk my life for it and for it? And what they found is that they absolutely would deny those things to them. And so we have a history of not allowing people to enjoy the freedoms and the privileges that they fought for, willing to die for. And this history follows us into the present day. There's a concept I cover in the book, I call it superlative citizenship. And the concept of superlative citizenship is when we all recognize that there is a social contract between the nation and its people, and that the people agree to certain responsibilities and obligations. We pay our taxes, respond to the draft, we follow the laws, etc. And the nation is responsible for ensuring our security and making prosperity and opportunity available to us. And what superlative citizenship says is when the nation is in breach of its end of the social contract, superlative citizens uphold and even exceed their end of the social contract in hopes that doing so will then compel the nation to extend the rights and privileges of citizenship that have been previously denied. And this has been a tactic that Black Americans in particular have employed since the nation was founded, with varying measures of success. But I think over the scope of the nation's life, over its 200 plus years of existence, the incremental progress we've realized on race relations, all the way through Truman's desegregation of the military through to the Civil Rights Act of '64, are a result of Black folks willing to die for a country that did not recognize their right to be included in it. And that calls to mind, or it brings forth, it spotlights the hypocrisy of our actions and our principles in a way that eventually works with other things to lead the country to take action.
Thank you, Ted, for that historical perspective. I mean, that lends itself to the saying that, you know, historically Black and brown people have fought for a country that in return have not fought for them as well. And there are instances time and time again where we have seen that play out. But Meg, for you, my question is, while there are certain instances where we have seen where racial integration in the military or social change has occurred is very limited, whether it be Montford Point Marines or the Harlem Hellfighters or Navajo Code Talkers, you know, where we have in retrospect seen the change that has been impacted by that. I would like to know, for you as someone who's not served in uniform but has studied and worked in and around the defense establishment, how have you viewed the role of the military as a driver of social change, specifically as it relates to racial integration?
I think there needs to be somewhat of a speak truth to power moment about what it might mean to be in the military overall. You know, especially when you're talking about people of color in the United States, and some context is needed in that respect. So when I'm thinking of people of color, I'm thinking of Native Hawaiians, Native Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Black Americans. And to provide some context, think about this. These groups are more likely to live in poverty or have higher unemployment rates than white Americans, attend schools with fewer resources, less likely to have health insurance, and higher rates of PTS that aren't accounted for by socioeconomic status or any sort of history of psychiatric disorders, right? So that being said, when we talk about social change, you know, using the military as a driver for social change, it really is about economics, because what you're talking about, given the context that I just provided, these groups, you're talking about a guaranteed paycheck. So this myth of patriotism and that's why you join, and this overarching, you know, ethos of citizenship, it's not that esoteric. It really is quite practical. And so it is an individual choice that over time can bring about social change. But when you're talking about going from living in perhaps a household that is at or below the poverty line to have a guaranteed paycheck twice a month, health and dental care, where you have an annual physical that's required that you get every year. I mean, there are many civilians who you might be able to get it, you don't. There, it's a requirement. The education benefits, it is an ability to see something on the horizon. So those long lead things really do actually matter. But initially, it is really about something much more tactical than the strategic ethos of it all, or what you can get in the long run. You know, knowing that you have allowances for housing and perhaps food to some degree, that healthcare, dental care, education benefits in the long run, like you can work towards a degree, or afterwards you do have your GI Bill and other such things. And Ted noted that there were problems with that throughout the course of the nation's history, where that was not allocated in the way that was equitable or just for many people of color when they left the military, although that was something that was promised. I do think when it has been something where racial integration the military has served as a place where racial integration can happen, but much like any group of citizens, when you put them together, you see self-segregation happen within them. You know, so even on a college campus, when we look at college campuses as an instructor, when I look at a classroom of 200 students, you can see this group of students here, this group here, this group there. Look at any dining facility in the military. You see that in the same way. So it is a place where it could be a reservoir of integration, and it is because you are brought together by your circumstances of your job. This is a job. This is still a job. It is not, that is something that needs to be underscored, that the military is a job like any other job. You know, it is different in many respects, but it's still a job. And so using it as this bastion of, and holding it up high as this bastion of integration and what it can do and what it means, I think needs to be tempered with the reality that it's a job. You know, there's some ethos underlying it, but it's a job. So I do think that it is a place where it could happen, but college campuses are the same way, where you bring it, you know, schools are very specific about trying to bring in diverse populations, but within that, there's only so much you can do, because where do you go home? Who are your friends? Things like that. So I do believe that the military does a lot, but it shouldn't be held up as the gold standard of how to bring about racial integration in society.
So I have a follow-up for you, Meg. And so I'm just thinking about back to, I'm thankful that you brought up the piece about kind of silo, because when I listed in the Marine Corps and you go through Parris Island boot camp, everybody's referred to as green. It's either dark green or black green. There is no real diversity there. And then once you get out into what's called the fleet, you know, you learn very quickly, like, this is just a microscopic view of what's happening in the world. I remember getting to my first duty station and seeing, you know, stars and bars on the back of a F-150 truck. And I'm like, okay, this is a little bit different, and kind of having to recalibrate with what my expectation and even my perception. So knowing that less than 1% of the population is serving now, if you as a civilian, what do you think are some of the actions that could take place, and perceptions that need to be, again, knocked down, so we have that real view of what is going on? Because I think you have to be, that truth to life piece has to take place before you can give concrete or realistic suggestions for a way forward.
And Ted spoke about this a bit in his opening remarks, just in terms of where the diversity is in the military. The military overall, over time, has gotten increasingly more diverse, but that diversity has not been found often in officer ranks. You know, much of the diversity has come in with respect to enlisted service members, and that's where you start. But how do you promote and retain? It is really about promotion and retention over time to more senior ranks, and particularly within your officer corps. So when you have officers over time who, you know, are serving long periods of time, what makes them get out at 05, 06 rather than, you know, trying to get, you know, that first star and other such things? That has to be actually reconciled and acknowledged, you know. And really, it's going to take senior military officers, because that's where that change has got to happen. You know, it can't be something that Congress forces in many respects, because there are limits to that. Has to actually say, hey, we don't look like our general officer corps, our senior officer corps does not look like the rest of this service. Is this a priority for us? It has to be something that is a priority for either for the service, the department writ large, and also at that 3- and 4-star level for the president, because those are very specifically selected individuals, but you've got to get them through the 05, 06, 07, 08 threshold.
Thanks, Meg. One of the reasons we're excited to have, a non-veteran on board, to get us away from the navel gazing, but it's this idea of puncturing the savior myth that the American military likes to tell about itself a lot. This idea that in the 90s, with the ascent of Colin Powell, we somehow solved race in America. To go back a little bit beyond that, and really for both of you, but to tee on something Ted alluded to, was, this idea of superlative citizenship and, there's other things that lead us to take action. We saw a lot of examples in World War II where you had all the symbolism, you had participation, but either no action or a counter-reaction to actually keep Blacks, in their place, and to keep anything from to keep any of these efforts of integration from bleeding into civil society. Could either of you talk to us about, well, what is that other thing that leads us to take action if the military as its own moral force isn't sufficient to drive change?
Yeah, it's a great question. Here's an interesting tidbit that I think will help us understand it. In the Civil War, something like 16 Black Americans were awarded the Medal of Honor. The Buffalo Soldiers fighting on the frontier, something like just under 20 were awarded the Medal of Honor. In World War I and II, no Black Americans were awarded the Medal of Honor. The medals that eventually came to them were done decades later by Presidents Bush and Clinton and Obama. But in the day, when Black folks responded to the draft, they went and fought overseas, often having to sit in segregated parts of bases where white POWs could access that Black soldiers could not, often having to fight under the flag of other nations like France, because segregated units in the Army didn't want to fight alongside white units, didn't want to fight alongside Black units. All of this, and then back to the GI Bill, not having access to many of those benefits. What we saw was that the character of one's service did not help them attain the access to the democracy in which they defended. And so there was, in other words, you could not earn your way into Americanism, even if you were willing to die, even if the character of your service was worthy of a Medal of Honor. You could not earn your way into equality. You could not behave your way into dignity and respect. And so what has moved us? And this is, I love this question because it hits on another tenet I write about in the book, which I call trickle-down citizenship. And this is the idea that if you make a moral claim of the state, like I am a person, I am an American, therefore I should be treated with dignity and have access to liberty and equality, that moral claim in and of itself is often insufficient to win the day, to win the argument. Instead, you have to marry your moral claim with a national interest. And a way of, so many examples from our history that I could use to sort of make the point, but what I'll use is the massive racial transformation that happened in our country between 1948 and 1968, which I sort of hinted at the top. The reason Truman decides to sign the executive orders to desegregate the federal workforce and to desegregate the military isn't just because Black service members fighting overseas came home and were often lynched when they returned back to their community, sometimes even in uniform. That was shocking to him. That was an eye-opener to him, but it's not what made him sign those executive orders. What he realized was that he was going to lose the election of 1948 unless he could get Black voters who were part of the Great Migration that had left the South and come to the North and can now vote in states like New York and Illinois and Ohio. If he couldn't win those Black voters, he was probably going to lose the election. And this is the infamous newspaper, Dewey beats Truman. Well, they didn't poll Black people. And it turns out Truman actually wins the majority, a vast majority of Black voters in some of these Great Migration states and wins the election. The reason we have Brown v. Board, the reason Eisenhower sends in the 101st Airborne into Little Rock, Arkansas to desegregate the school, the reason we have the Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 65, Fair Housing Act of 68, isn't because there was a wash of epiphanies happening in white America. It's not because our presidents had this spirit of magnanimity that they wanted to, that suddenly saw the, help them see that these Black folks in their country were now humans and worthy of being treated as citizens. It was because it was married to a national interest. After World War II, the Soviets were going around telling everyone that would listen that the United States is basically a hypocritical nation. It's running around telling people that they are the country of democracy and freedom and liberty. And the Russians, every time the United States would make this claim, they would say, and you lynch Negroes, as a way of completely undermining everything the United States says they stand for by pointing out how they were treating their own citizens. So it was the mix of the Cold War plus the Civil Rights Movement that led to change in the country. And so this is a long answer to say that the moral claim for equality in and of itself was insufficient. The attempt to earn equality by willing to sacrifice your life in military service was insufficient. But when you could marry that moral claim and moral action alongside a national security interest, like defeating the Russians in the Cold War and maintaining global influence over sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, where these Cold War battlefields are taking place, then you have the opportunity. A window opens for massive change, and that's exactly what we saw in the mid-20th century.
It's always fascinating that even after, and then of course, even after Truman desegregates the military, the Army drags its feet until it's forced to open up more positions to meet the needs of the Korean War. I'm sorry, Meg, did you have thoughts on this one?
I think Ted actually hit the nail on the head. It is really about the interests. It is about political interest. This is still, as much as we like to think that the military is apolitical, it is the strongest political instrument a commander-in-chief has at his or her disposal. It is, what happens there within the military actually shines, highlights a lot of what the interests are of that individual and the foreign policy. Foreign policy overall, defense policy, national security policy is about interests, and interests will win the day. And you just hope those moments in history that Ted so eloquently noted are punctuated when those two things together, when political interests and moral interests come together and ideals come together. Those are seminal moments in history, but we have very few of those moments. And that's why we tend to kind of gravitate to them. So when Colin Powell ascended to become the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, it was like, oh, look what we have. And that's been almost 30 years, if not more than 30 years, and that's the fact that people still know his names. My students who are, weren't born when he served in that role still know his name and hold him up as a standard of a Black man in military leadership, where they know him as General Powell and not Secretary Powell. That actually is really very important, where that differentiation is critical. And it's something I picked up on, where I have students who are 18 who refer to him as General Powell and have never known him in that role.
So to that end, that's a great lead in for a question that I want to present to you, Meg, as a follow-up, and present to you, Ted, as well. Kind of the perception, if you will, about the military and its leaders. Again, we have kind of cherry-picked one or two names here, but, and kind of, I want to intersect this, if you will, with kind of patriotism, if you will, and who we view as patriots and defenders. I'm thinking back to when I went into my recruiter's office and the Marine Corps posters, there were very few people, if I saw any that represented me, it was probably a white, younger guy, probably would be considered, Christian, cisgendered, and just the pride of America and of apple pie. Even very few women, in their dress blues or in their Charlies, and that. But kind of this idea with the perception of what America may see or others may see as defenders of the U.S., how that plays into public opinion of the military. And again, this can even go into a conversation about military occupational specialty. Do we only see infantry men as defenders, as if there are no support roles? I love the conversation, everyone is viewed as the person that was in SEAL Team 6 or either carried a fire team on their back all alone up a hill in Kandahar, as if there are no admin people, there are no Motor T or 88 Mike if you're in the Army, there are no support roles. So if you kind of talk about how we view leaders or defenders of the US, and I also like to tie in, throwing the monkey wrench here, with the insurrection that took place on the 6th, and seeing people that were dressed out in gear, in tactical gear, or claiming to be patriots, or that being viewed as patriotism, but Colin Kaepernick not being viewed as a patriot because of holding our country accountable to the promises that is made. How that might judge or move our perception of military. I know a lot there, but I wanted to give you something to talk about there, and this is for both of you. But Meg, please follow up.
You gave us a lot to talk about there.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's what we're here for. We're not
You
here
raised
to
the
play
point that
checkers, so we might as well talk about it.
where 5'11" pants became like the utmost, you know, the sign of somebody who is tactical in the fight, you know. But that being said, when we think about who is, you know, a patriot, it's the who, and it really is. When you look at the classic military posters, they're all white people. They're all white men traditionally. And often if it's a white woman, because they're going to be a white woman, they're often in roles that are very gendered. They're the nurse, they're the Navy nurse, they're, you know, which Navy nurses are amazing and valuable, but it's often they're very gendered, and even within support roles. But what you don't see are those support roles, which is where people of color, the distribution of people of color in the military fall largely within those support roles. And we know this when you can think about commanders of fast attack subs, the Black commanders of fast attack subs number themselves and know each other by numbers. So I'm number 10, I'm number 13. I believe there's still less than 20 of them overall. SEALs are the same way. And it becomes, until we get to the point where those numbers don't matter, or maybe hit triple digits, you know, it might fall by the wayside besides the legaciness of it all. When we think about who does what, the defenders of our freedom are the guys at the pointy end of the spear. They are those who kick in doors and other such things. And we just traditionally just have a very specific perception that has been cultivated over time about who fights and what fighting means, not what goes into enabling. Combat enablers, did you go outside the wire? Were you on missions every night? Oh, you're a fobbit. Like the military does it within themselves, you know? So it becomes who is legitimate. And unless you had a bullet go whizzing by your head, you know, multiple times in firefights, unless you have those stories at the VFW, or you can come home to tell your family, it's as if you're not as patriotic from that perspective. Like, oh, you can get your awesome blossom at, you know, Applebee's every military holiday, but the conversation becomes, well, what did you do? How did you do it? And I've seen this happen. But I think what's really important is to understand when you're talking about race, like when we think about infantry, you know, and combat arms, you know, do you see that aviator? Do you see that that commander, that squadron commander, you know, as a Black man or Black woman? Or do you see that squadron commander as a white man or white woman? You're going to normally go with the latter. Like, you're normally going to see the latter. But I think what's really important is we've got to just get more people to that point where, and it's not necessarily a pipeline issue because there are people who want to do it, but what is happening between that, you know, and looking at the officer ranks at this point, because it's really about who leads, that 01 to 04, you know, level, what happens there? And I don't know, I'm not in the military. I've not been part of any combat unit to know, but there is something that makes that path to leadership highly unattractive for people of color, it seems, where they'd rather get out, you know, and go do something else than stay in and lead. So, you know, and it's also very interesting when you think of somebody like Secretary Austin, the type of general he was. He wasn't one of those rock star generals out in front. I mean, he was a rock star general, like, no doubt, but very few people, he wasn't on Meet the Press every week. His name wasn't being talked about all the time in people's households in the same way Petraeus and other people were, but yet he was able to advance. And even then, you know, I sat in this very office and listened to somebody when his nomination came up and refer to him as fairly capable. I mean, at that time, I was very happy that Zoom had a mute image feature, because to refer to somebody of his pedigree as fairly capable, you would never have said that. No one would have ever said that about General Petraeus. Mm-hmm. You know, because he's a patriot. He's a patriot. This is what America's best. The pedigree and the path to power is very similar of these men, right? But yet, that is something that happened. And it was quite, I talked about it actually in a recent piece that I did, to hear someone say that and to question his patriotism, to be perfectly honest. His patriotism and his capability was really hard. But I do think that, I don't know if someone like him falls short and can't, as Ted has pointed out, if he can't get to that point, we just have to get more. I guess it's the fact that you just have to get more people there, but I don't know what happens. And I don't know what happens that makes leaving the military more attractive than staying in it, even at that level. And I think that's something Ted could speak to as someone who served much better than I could.
So I'm with Meg. There's a lot in the question, so I'm going to try to get through it quickly. So there's a few points I want to make. The first is that in the United States, language is racialized. So when I say a thug, immediately what comes to your mind is probably a Black person. When I say immigrant, probably someone who's Hispanic. When I say terrorist, probably someone of Arabic origin. And when I say patriot or American, it's usually a white Christian. And we don't have to guess at this. All of the polling shows that the prototypical American, most Americans see that person as a white person. I think only 2% saw a Black person as being a prototypical American patriot. And there's more than 2% of the country that's Black. So that's not just, on white people. This is the image has sort of infected us all or influenced us all. The second is, because of this, critiques of America are also racialized. And so when you hear Black Lives Matter people say that this nation has a racist history and is prejudiced against Black people, for a country that views white Americans as the prototypical patriot or prototypical American, then critiques of the country can be received as critiques of the entire white race. Remember when athletes were not going to the White House when Donald Trump was president because they didn't want to, receive their championship trophies there. But one team did go, with the Pittsburgh Penguins, a professional hockey team. And on this team, every one of them was white except for one Black guy. And on the day that they went to the White House to get the Stanley Cup, the Black guy actually had a previous engagement. So there was only white people behind the president. And the president, wanting to point out how unpatriotic Kaepernick was, how unpatriotic the NBA teams were, says, look at these great patriots. And the problem was that 60% of the team were Canadians and Europeans. They weren't even Americans. But he assumed that because they played an American sport and there were white men behind them, that they obviously are Americans and obviously are better patriots than those ungrateful Black athletes that are causing all this ruckus. So why does this all matter? This is what gets us to January 6th. In international relations, there's this framework called ontological security. It's the idea that a nation's character or its identity is as treasured as its economic stability and its national security. And so the reason, if you think about September 11th, the reason that the terrorists went after the White House, the World Trade Center, and the Pentagon, it was because of the things those things symbolized. It was an ontological security attack, in other words, because we are a nation known for our democracy, our military power, and our economic might. And so what's the symbol of our economic might? World Trade Center, New York City. What's the symbol of our democracy? The White House. Fortunately, some patriots, actual patriots, brought Flight 93 down in Pennsylvania before it hit the White House. And what's the symbol of our military power? The Pentagon, which was hit. And so the idea here wasn't to cripple the nation. It was to cripple our our reputation, our brand, what it means to be American to the rest of the world. So similarly, when you have a nation that is rapidly diversifying, where our demography is changing, and there's a cohort in this country that feels threatened by this change, they feel that critiques of the country, critiques of law enforcement, critiques of government, critiques of our institutions are actually an attempt to move white people out of the way to make room for all these new people of color. Then that is felt as an ontological security attack on the group. And this is why mostly militant-looking white men stormed the Capitol on January 6th with Confederate battle flags and thin blue line flags and not the American flag, because this was a way of defending themselves against this attack on what they perceive to be the true character of Americanism, the true brand, reputation, appearance of who is real and truly American.
Yeah, it's a fascinating dynamic. And one of the things both you alluded to, or Meg, particularly with the Austin nomination, I think it's worth taking a moment on that one. There's this always fascinating two-step where the military says, well, we're not racial, we only see green, therefore any discussion must be something negative or somebody trying to get ahead. And it's fascinating. I remember sitting with your prototypical white male infantryman once who would be adamant that, there was no racism in the military, but yet he was lamenting being passed over for command of the 75th Ranger Regiment. And he said that was because, of course, that he wasn't part of the West Point Mafia, right? So he could see the way personal connections and biases could work in one dimension, but not in race. So I guess let's dig a little more into, we went through all those discussions with the nomination of Austin. You experienced it personally. What do you think? What will be the legacy effects of the Austin nomination? Will there be cascading effects? Will it be another one-off like Powell? And if either of you could think through, we're in a different place than we were in the 90s. Is it better or worse? Is this going to be just another the quota for the next 25 years, okay, we had one, we'll talk about Austin for the next 25 years, or are we at the chance where we might see significant change?
I think what matters is what comes next. It's not necessarily Austin in this moment right now. It's what happens next, who the next administration, whomever the next administration is, what is their priority? That's the legacy of Austin being there. And it's not necessarily at the SecDef level, it's who gets considered for the undersecretaries, who, is there, because if you look at who the political appointees within the Department of Defense, particularly OSD staff, which has been, where the bulk of them are, this is a very diverse group of political appointees. I mean, like very, very diverse group. And so that was something that was very important to the Biden-Harris administration, and they've done that, but it's what happens next. And I think this is a political game. If it's in the interest of the next if there is a way that the interests are held, like if we can hold the interests, and sadly, interests usually are highlighted by something horrible happening. So whether it be Me Too or more brown and black men or women killed by police, that progress usually comes after something horrible happens. And so I don't think the Austin nomination and confirmation are very important, but unless the interest can be held, that it's important to have people in those areas. So it's going to take Ted's book gaining traction and being part of, and I say this honestly, being part of the reading list. That's something very basic. Make it be part of the reading list at, Chief of Staff of the Army, all the services, and also at
the service academies and military schools. Make it like those are small signs, very small signs, but important signs that issues of race and ethnicity within the military are important. So it's going to take those steps to ensure that this is institutionalized and not a one-off. Like this should be something that's very routine. And yes, I know he's my co-panelist, so, you know, but at the same time, it does take that. That's what it takes. It takes somebody teaching an intro to IR course and starting with, you know, Du Bois and not necessarily, you know, realism, you know, but starting with some foundational, like changing the way we look at the foundation of things. And that's what happens. Otherwise, exactly what you said will come to fore, where you have this Austin as SecDef, and we talk about him for the next 50 years as, well, look, this happened, so we're good. We're in a post-racial era. So that's my perspective on that.
No pressure, Ted. It's up to you.
Right. Oh, geez, we're doomed, man. No, so here's what I'll say. So the Austin nomination absolutely matters. Colin Powell being chairman mattered. Obama being president, it matters. But what we often do is we take the bumper sticker way out of racism, which is to say, we have solved something. Because how else could a Black man be president or chairman or SecDef? And it's just not that easy. I don't know if this is a one-off, the early signs of a wave of change coming through previously homogenous institutions to be more diverse. We'll see. But I will say this. When I was an early promotee to 04, and I had a colleague tell me, a fellow officer say that it was because of affirmative action. When I was selected for the White House Fellowship, I had the guy that sat next to me at the Naval War College said, how much of your selection was because you were Black? And in the same breath, some of my closest friends from the military to this day are white men who probably voted for Trump in definitely voted for Trump in 2016. I don't know about 2020. And so it is, you know, the military is a place where both things can be true, where you can create these interracial friendships and experience racism. The way this fits in the Austin nomination is because the way people receive difference in institutions is rarely about the character of that person. They drag in all of these other stereotypes and caricatures and perceptions to the thing. So whether Austin is qualified or not is not a real question. His record speaks for itself. But the fact that it's questioned and held up, well, how does he compare to Petraeus or Mullen or Dempsey or these other guys, or to you know, Chuck Hagel or Panetta? You know, these are ways of trying to highlight difference as a way of denigrating or demoting the significance of Austin. The last thing I'll say here, and the Civ Mill scholars know this way better than I do, there are lots of qualified people that could have done the SecDef job this time around. Austin wasn't the only one. You know, there were multiple people, multiple women, multiple men of different races, multiple women of different races. And so the fact that Austin was chosen was a political decision. Okay, and we act like, well, if he was chosen because he was Black, that cheapens the selection. No, it doesn't. He's qualified for the job, just like other people were. But that administration made a political decision to bring Austin on instead of other folks, instead of a woman, or instead of, you know, anyone else that they chose. And the fact that he was, you know, required a waiver for being in service so recently, these were all political decisions. And it's okay. We can have political decisions in a way that diversifies the institution, especially if it's married to our moral compass that views diversity as a strength. Now, 10 years from now, will there be another one? I don't know. It will depend on the politics. It will depend on the pool, the candidate pool, as Meg has talked about. But what this should not symbolize is that, one, we have solved the problem, or two, that we are now set a new trajectory for the institution. These things will be negotiated given the climate in which the decisions need to be made and the people making those decisions.
So to that end, following up, I wanted to stay on Austin, and again, for both of you, I'm going to ask you to put on your fortune telling hat and kind of what would you like to see? And there have been initiatives that I think are a step in the right direction. Again, is it the end all be all? No, like the looking at white supremacy in the military ranks, and the I believe it was the 90-day or the 100-day study that they were doing, reviewing the Confederate names for military bases. That's a good start. But what would you like to see come out of, maybe, what would you like to hear come out of, maybe, let's look at the study on white supremacy or racism in the military. What would you like to see come out of this? And the follow-up is, what other pieces, whether it's low-hanging fruit or whether it's more, a deeper dive, would you like to see Alston do during his tenure? Acknowledging that it is unfair to expect him to fix all the things, which that is often put on the backs of Black and brown people. We broke something, we're counting on you to fix it. And if you don't, then it was a crapshoot in the first case. That's not fair, but we know the rules of the game, man. It's up to us to try to change that or either play within those rules. So first piece, what would you like to see? What would you like to hear come out of the study? And also, what else do you think that General Alston or Secretary Alston could tackle in his tenure? Meg, I'll give you up first, and Ted, you can follow.
I think that white supremacy study needs to be more than simply documenting that there's white supremacy in the military. That is important. That is critical. That needs to happen. But there have to be tangible consequences, because people respond to consequences. And yet again, not being a military member, I don't know what that involves. What sort of non-judicial punishment can come from it? What sort of changes to the UCMJ need to happen? But there has to be some consequence for issues related to white supremacy. Documenting them is important. Documenting the extent and breadth, like the depth and breadth of white supremacy in the military needs to happen, because there are people who believe that it's not an issue, that it's still those few bad apples and other such things. Documenting that is important, and understanding the locus of it is important, but something needs to happen starting probably in boot camp or OCS. Like, there has to be something that happens at the very junior levels to talk about what is acceptable and what is not with respect to behavior, and behavior even among your fellow forces, but also outside of a military context, because that's where you see the insurrection. That was technically outside of a military context, but we now have evidence that there are people who are veterans and current reservists and current active duty members who participated in this. So there have to be some tangible consequences for it. That has to happen. And with respect to other things, I think it has to be beyond. Like, white supremacy also cannot be equated with simply hating Black people, because white supremacy means white supremacy above all. So it has to really tackle, like, now that people are actually paying attention to anti-Asian discrimination and hate and things like that, but just understanding, is it immigrants, other such things. It needs to be as expansive as possible while being getting the information that needs to happen. So it cannot be, a why do you all hate Black people situation, because that will not help. But it's, what do we mean by white supremacy and why that matters? So there has to be an articulation when the results go out among commanders. That conversation has to go down to levels. So there has to be some sort of order or something like that, where commanders have conversations and ongoing conversations with their forces about why white supremacy like is not acceptable, and what it does and how it degrades the force. Like, why in an environment with white supremacy being allowed, would it be impossible to achieve the tasks that they have been called upon and they're training to do? How does that degrade readiness, capability, and other such things? That conversation needs to tie together, because your military force, why does it matter for the military? And why does it matter for you, you know, Lance Corporal Johnson, and what you want to do? Because people are like, oh, that's above my, you know, it's above me. And it's like, no, like there needs to be a way, whether it be from SecDef order down throughout commander's intent documents, about why that matters. That has to be something that we see in those documents that young service members are forced to read and know and have conversations about.
Yeah, I would echo that point, that one, commanders have to be forthright about what is and is not acceptable in service, and racial intolerance should not be acceptable, and that you can't just say that it's not acceptable, but there has to be consequences. Look, if you've served, then you know you give up part of your First Amendment rights. There are things you cannot say. If you're in uniform, you can't call the president an idiot, or you're not supposed to, because it's in violation of the UCMJ. And so, but if there are no penalties for it, then what's the point of having the thing on the book? So if you are only talking about white supremacy being a problem or racial intolerance being a problem, and then no one is penalized for adhering to the beliefs, for practicing those beliefs, and for discriminating either on or off the job, in or out of uniform, then they're just words, and they're meaningless. But if there are consequences for those actions, then especially for a culture like the military, those consequences will reverberate across the force. Even if the person that's guilty of the thing is the son of an admiral or the daughter of a general, if they are subscribing to these beliefs and are practicing these beliefs that are incompatible with our Constitution, incompatible with the nation's principles, incompatible with our services, then they should be out. And so in terms of what can Austin do, aside from those two things, to speak forthrightly about it and then to hold people accountable when they fall short, I'm not sure, because the military really is a cross-section of society. And so the best way to make a better military is to make a better country, to make a better society. And whatever problems exist in our country will find their way into the military. And then leaders like Austin and the service secretaries and commanders, et cetera, will have to wrestle with those things. So to the extent the Department of Defense can be a vehicle for positive social change, both economically, but rather socioeconomically, I think that will actually have positive implications for the future of military service. And we don't, again, this is not something we have to guess at. We've seen what happens when principled leaders move the executive branch to be closer to our constitutional principles, like when we desegregate the military, that at the time it may be rejected and called a social experiment, but in the long run, it turned out to be more American and made the nation stronger over the course of the last few decades.
These are great points. We've had we're a little bit after 1. We've had some questions come up in the chat that I think we've addressed to a degree, but I encourage the audience, go ahead and put your questions in now. We've got these 2 great speakers for another good 20 minutes here. In keeping kind of with Austin, again, in this 2-step of, everybody wants to make a lot about, or you can be accused of trying to make something of the symbolism of Austin. And again, it becomes kind of a catch-22, right? If he's celebrated, then everybody's going to talk about it as if it's something that, maybe he didn't deserve. It was a token. But by the same token, the military itself, I'm reminded of the story of Dory Miller, the Navy crewman who manned a machine gun at Pearl Harbor, and how the Office of War Information suppressed both his name and his image from being used because they didn't want to portray a picture of African Americans fighting as part of the cause for the beginning of World War too, right? There was always this deference to Southern sensibilities. One of the questions, I guess, in terms of then, how do we fix the idea that Austin is a one-off, is these pathways that we have, right? Somebody can come out of the political world with no military experience and be SecDef, as we've had before. But why is it, or how is it, and what does the pool look like for folks? What else do we have to fix, maybe besides just the military, to get more folks in this pool to be SecDef?
Yeah, so I'll tell you, it's not a question of like expertise. So for example, Silicon Valley has a very difficult time attracting Black graduates who are STEM majors. And it's not because there's not enough of them. There are more Black computer science graduates, engineering graduates today than there ever been. But the culture of Silicon Valley turns qualified candidates off. And the same can be said of in the military. I mean, I've been on ships where I was the only Black officer in the wardroom. And, and so when we pull into a port somewhere and everyone wants to go to the country western bar and I want to go listen to R&B music, I can either go hang out with enlisted folks and be accused of fraternization, or I can go hang out at the country western bar and be a good team player with officers that and not enjoy my time, but so there's a cultural piece of a culture of acceptance, inclusion, and tolerance that I think the military could improve on in order to increase the number of people that are willing to stick around through the pathways to chairman and the pathways to SecDef. As the point was, as Anthony made the point earlier around MOSs, there are not a lot of Black pilots, certainly not in the Navy or Marine Corps. There are certain specialties that they're disproportionately represented by Black Americans, and then others where they're underrepresented. And the third thing I will say, though, is I left after a 20-year career. I was competitive for 06, if my detailers to be believed. And I left because I am the father of 3 Black boys. And I was less interested in what China was doing in cyberspace, though I know it's very important, than I was in what kind of world, what kind of country am I going to leave behind for my kids. And so the best thing that can happen for the Department of Defense, military service, and creating military leaders is creating an institution, a culture, and a country that allows Black folks with these or people of color with these interests, and women with these interest areas, to stay in the institutions and thrive there without having to saddle undue burdens because of their gender, race, or ethnicity, either in the institution or in the nation writ large. It's a big ask, but this is the only way we can diversify the pipelines that will eventually create a broader, more diverse pool of applicants for these top tier political appointee positions.
Meg, I know you have a perspective on civilian personnel channels.
Yeah, civilian personnel is difficult because what ends up happening, and I've had this conversation with several folks, is when people retire from the military, a lot of times they will go into the civil service. That is a viable option, and particularly with veterans preference being such a huge advantage, they will go into the civil service. Oftentimes they will go into their service, their respective service. So when you look at the civilian staff among the services, while it's still not diverse, it's much more diverse than an organization like OSD or the various elements of OSD writ large. So that becomes really difficult, because I remember there were times when I would look around when I was on, OSD staff and be like, yeah, I'm really the only one. And when Bishop Garrison wrote that article about walking into a room, I remember backbenching slurgs and 3-star meetings and being the only Black person in the room. And not just the only Black person, the only person of color in the room. That is extremely unwelcoming. Even if people were welcoming, if you were the only one, that meant if you were gone, people noticed you were gone. If you did something if you showed up late, people noticed you were late. There is always oh, I noticed you. And in many respects, people are like, oh, they noticed me, but why are they noticing you? And that can be taken in positive ways, but also in negative ways. I do think that OSD staff is very similar to, I think, the Foreign Service, where if you want people to come work high-level defense policy, you've got to go and really identify folks and shepherd them in through the PMF program, and not, go when the PMF program is recruiting, for the services and the services and OSD staff. It need not be, I'm not saying you have to go to an HBCU, because Black people go to schools in other places too, but, make it a point to maybe go to some HBCUs to be like, this is why working as a civilian within the Department of Defense might be a good thing. Because let me tell you, when it came time for someone to go to those schools for any sort of recruiting, I got sent. I did not go to an HBCU. So that sort of having that conversation of what it's like to come from an HBCU and come and work, for a service or OSD staff, I don't have that perspective, but I am the one Black woman they had around. So they're like, if not you, who? So that has to change in many respects. It really does. And you have to have some people who you convince to do some things, to be first, to be one of the few. And the issue is that there are far too many other careers where you might be few in number, but you're not one of the few. There are far too many departments and agencies and things like that and national security is horrible at this writ large, where you are, once you start progressing up the ladder, you are one of the few, and if not the only one, and that is hard. So you have to have people you retain. You need to know that you can thrive in places like that. And that's something that Ted talked about. Thriving, like, that's part of, not just because people will stay in a job until they can find something else. That is something that'll happen. But you want people to thrive and really want to be there. And those people, so give them those, make sure they know that, hey, you can go and work at the NSC or OS, like those specialized things that happen that get people, how many people of color have been special assistants to policy or SecDef, and other such, those things that get you promoted. How many times have you found, like, women more so, but how many people of color have you seen as the special assistant, like civilian special assistant for a chief of staff or a secretary or undersecretary? Very few overall. And if you can, you're thinking of one or two, and we're probably all thinking of the same person.
I want to say very quickly that another hurdle that the department should be aware of is the security clearance.
Yes.
For a lot of folks, no matter your race, if you grew up at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, you're probably helping parents out with bills. You probably have lots of student loan and credit card debt, and all of these things can hurt your ability to get a security clearance, especially as a DoD civilian or in the NSC or these other places. So the earlier you tell college students about the security clearance requirements and the need to ensure you have no arrests or your credit is in order, or that if you're from a particular neighborhood, that you are aware of who you're hanging around and who you send the interviewers to when you're looking for this stuff. The more they know about the process up front, the more likely they are to be successful in clearing that major hurdle.
Ted, I want to follow up on something that you and Meg have both said in the kind of theme of thriving, what keeps people in service. And I'm just speaking from the in-uniform perspective now, but I wonder if any of you have examined any portions of the topic of how the Uniform Code of Military Justice, or UCMJ, is unfairly or unevenly distributed, because that can impact how people are promoted, and it can have impact after you're out of uniform as well. So I wonder if you've seen any or done any studies on that. especially as it relates to Black and brown people in the military?
What I've seen is because I've not been in the military, I've not participated or been part of this, but just the studies I've read about the UCMJ, it's very similar to the criminal justice system, where you'll get a trial, you'll get, very similar trial. The punishment is often harsher for people of color, where there is no, like what I've seen, the punishment is often harsher. It is the ability for latitude is not often, or grace, the grace that is provided is not actually given. And also the things that commanders can do, where, and I don't know all the specifics of this, but where commanders can step in and be like, okay, no, we're not going to do this, or I'm going to use my authority to do X, Y, and Z. That often is not, commanders often, that is not equitably distributed, where we see more Black and brown people in front of courts martials, and facing harsher penalties, being levied harsher penalties in the distribution of sentencing and other such things. So, but that is something that's well outside of my understanding writ large.
Yeah, I've not undertaken a comprehensive study on punishment, but one of my doctoral students last year looked at the promotion scoring of Army officers and its relationship to how they score on a racial resentment index, and found that the higher they scored on racial resentment, it's a sociological sort of index that basically tries to get a sense for how you view groups other than yourself. And the higher they scored, which is to say, the more difference they discerned between their group and others, the more likely they were to be harsher in their promotion evaluations of officers of color. And this isn't to say that they were racist, that they were looking to make sure Black folks didn't get promoted, or that women didn't get promoted, et cetera. But this is the term implicit bias where this comes in. And it's this idea that you sort of, because of the stereotypes and the caricatures we're fed about different groups, and because we sort of voluntarily socially segregate ourselves at times, we don't know well the people that we're often in charge of, and then we rely on these caricatures or our implicit biases when we grade their bearing or their performance, et cetera. The good thing about implicit bias is that you can actually train people to take a breath before taking an action to sort of assess why they're characterizing a person's service in one way, where someone else similarly situated but in a different group receives a higher or lower mark. But before you can train yourself to notice it and then work yourself out of it, you have to acknowledge that it actually has an influence on how you perceive others. And that's one of the bigger hurdles. And so I can imagine if this influences how people evaluate, how leaders, officers evaluate those that are reporting to them in promotion scenarios, naturally there has to be some effect in punishment scenarios where they're determining how someone should be reprimanded for taking some action it's not permitted.
Some fascinating discussion. And just before we move to closing comments, or to tee up your closing comments, we've had some great discussion going in the chat, led by a friend of most of us, Kathy Roth-Duquet, talking about these altered perceptions of who sees the military as green, who doesn't, coincidentally reinforcing some findings even from when I studied 15 years ago, where most of the military white officers or senior officers who happen to be white all think the military is doing fantastic on issues of race relations. Generally, only a minority of minority service members will agree that the military is doing better than civilian society in terms of racial integration, which takes us kind of full circle, I think, to this idea of the symbolism of military service. And, as we wrap up this conversation, I guess maybe as people have looked and engaged with the military over the years and said, okay, this is how I get citizenship, this is how I get a fair shake economically, maybe it's about proving that the military isn't this white knight, to mix a whole host of wrong imagery, but that it's not this thing that's going to solve all society's problems, but maybe a co-traveler in trying to figure this out. And unfortunately, I would love for all of us to address some of this discussion, but just given that kind of dynamic, to tee you guys up I want to give you time for closing comments. What do you think's next? In terms of the symbolism of the military, where do we go from here? If you had to wrap up, your hopes and thoughts on this wide range stuff we've talked about today, where should we leave it? Meg, you go first, and we'll leave the last word for Ted.
Thanks. What's next? I think so much of what's next is the work of a country. Like it really is. You can only do so much and Ted eloquently stated this earlier, you can only do so much in the military because you live in the country. And not everybody lives on base, and at some point you have to go off base. And so it's a lot of work. I think for so much of this, it's believing the lived experiences of those who don't look like you, and I think most people have had this experience, at least most people of color, I would say all of us at some point have had this experience where you're talking and you say something happens and you have a white person be like, that never happened, that couldn't happen. It's like, thanks. And then you stop, the conversation stops though. You don't want to have the conversation. You don't want to continue that conversation with someone because they've just called you a liar, or there's only so much purchase you're going to get in continuing a conversation about race and your experience within certain communities, whether it be national security or within the United States, on that. So I think so much of this comes to, if people, people talk about, I want to ally, I want to do this, and ally is a verb. Like you've got to do something. You have to do something. And so much of that is actually listening and believing. And in the moment where I've had students ask me, what should I do? I don't know what to do. And oftentimes it's those little things that really matter with your friends. So if somebody says a racial slur, no need to put yourself in danger. Like I would recommend not by being like, you can't say it. Just be like, no, dude, like we don't do that here. It's those little moments that if someone if a person of color sees you doing that without them being like, aren't you gonna say something? Because that is in many ways humiliating, to have somebody beg somebody to step up for you. You don't want to have to do that. But the small things like, no, dude, it's not right. You don't do that. Or in that moment, rather than telling the person of color, like, hey, I saw what happened back there and that was really messed up. Say something in the moment. Don't come to me later and say, I saw that happen and that was horrible. Well, thanks, because you're not helpful now. But it's those little things that have to happen. Change happens with very small moments up to leading up to something bigger. But often we're individuals. So you have to work on an individual basis to get to something for the group level. And I think that it has to be those small steps of listening and acting in the best way each individual knows how to say, this is not acceptable, this isn't appropriate, or, you know what, I've was talking to my friend Ted, and or even anonymously, I was talking to my friend, he's a Black man, and he had this experience, and you know, this is somebody I trust with my life, and the fact that he had this experience, validate it and use it as evidence in what you're saying. You don't have to say my name, but use that experience to validate what's happening. And to kind of circle back to something that Ted said earlier, where he talked about getting pulled over and using his military everything to kind of, you know, be like, hey, I'm just like you, you know. Sadly, I did that as a civilian, because when it came time, when I got pulled over, my CAT card was placed right next to my ID. My Harvard and Penn alumni cards were placed right there. Like, so I was not just giving you my driver's license and registration and insurance information. It was really going to be CAT card, alumni cards, driver, like everything. It's just going to be laying right there for you to, for, you know, the officer to see. I also made sure that I had parking stuff on my car. So when I worked for the Marine Corps, it was Henderson Hall, you know, and when I worked for OSD, because I was always out at bowling, I had bowling on there. And even though it showed that I was a civilian, I was like, but look, I'm part of this. Doesn't that make it even more? And that actually helped several times, you know, because if a Marine pulled me over and saw that I had a Marine CAT card and wanted to kind of judge me, I went through the effort of learning about the Marine Corps, the difference between East Coast, West Coast Marines, what meth was where, things like knowing that information. So if I needed to just have that really quick, very base level conversation to help myself, I could. So it's not something that only helps military, or could possibly help military members of color. I used it because of the legitimacy it gave me as a Black woman to possibly stave off something that could be much worse and a potential threat to my life.
Ted?
Yeah, I'll just say that, you know, the military, at least last I saw, was still the most respected government institution by Americans. And I think the more the citizenry can see that military members are not the exception, like we are not exceptional Americans just because we've decided to serve. No more than a teacher is exceptional, no more than, you know, a spouse that stays home with the kids is exceptional. And so the reason this is important is because for members, so people of color who serve, like we've just been talking about, we will often seek security in our affiliation with the thing you respect. That's not the answer of how to remedy what's wrong with our society. The answer is to respect the person, whether they're in uniform or not. And then that, you know, the benefits of that sort of societal relationship pours out to all aspects. So to the extent the military can lead that they can lead the, they can leverage the respect of the institution and help Americans see how we are all in this thing together and sort of on the same mission, then I think that is the way forward. And the only way that can happen is if the military looks like America, if it's in its leadership and its civilian capacity and its civilian leadership and its appointee positions at its lowest, highest levels. The military can only be a model for what a functioning society could look like on racial terms if it actually looks like the society it's protecting. At the moment, it doesn't. It's getting closer than it has been in the past. But to the extent it can leverage its institutional prestige to do so, I think that would be one advantage.
Well, thank you all so much to the panelists for participating in this important discussion, and to Anthony and Jason for framing these issues so thoughtfully and moderating a deeply necessary discussion. To learn about future events like this one, you can go to the CNAS website and click follow to sign up for email updates from the Military Veterans and Society program. And you can also follow CNAS on Twitter. Our next event in this Race in the Military series will be scheduled soon. We are looking forward to future discussions on race in the US Marine Corps and a future discussion on the effort to remove Confederate iconography from US military bases. Thank you for joining us, and please keep this conversation going.